In the high hollows of Pike County, the morning fog settles like a secret over these hills. A decade ago, a man everyone here feared guarded his moonshine stills with a ferocity that earned him the name Mountain Devil.
Between April 3rd and June 18, 1934, 15 men disappeared across three-county region of eastern Tennessee mountains during violent territorial war over illegal whiskey production and distribution networks that generated millions of dollars annually for families controlling routes between mountain stills and urban markets in Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Nashville, where Prohibition's recent repeal had created legal alcohol industry, competing with bootleggers who dominated trade for 14 years. By June 25th, all 15 were dead, their bodies discovered in locations deliberately chosen to mark every still site, warehouse and distribution point they'd attempted to seize from territory that John Wright had controlled since 1920. Sending message that Mountain Devil, nickname Wright had earned through systematic violence defending his operations, would tolerate no encroachment on whiskey empire he'd built through combination of superior product quality and ruthless elimination of anyone threatening his market dominance. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation would classify it as deadliest moonshine war in state history, unprecedented case where a single individual had systematically eliminated entire rival operation through campaign requiring business acumen and tactical violence that authorities had failed to prevent, despite knowing territorial conflict was escalating toward lethal confrontation. But motive wasn't simple criminality or psychopathic violence. It was businessman defending enterprise he'd built over 14 years, proving that economic competition in illegal markets created violence exceeding anything legitimate business disputes generated when legal remedies weren't available to resolve conflicts over territory and customers. If you're ready to hear how Mountain Devil became most feared moonshiner in Tennessee history, systematically exterminating 15 rivals who tried to steal his whiskey territory, hit that subscribe button. But understand this story contains dramatized account of systematic violence between criminal enterprises during early 1930s when moonshine remained profitable despite Prohibition's repeal and when territorial disputes were resolved through elimination rather than litigation or negotiation. Cockey County, Tennessee occupied 434 square miles of Smoky Mountain foothills in 1934, populated by 20,000 people, mostly farming tobacco or working in declining timber industry, or producing illegal whiskey that remained profitable despite December 1933, repeal of Prohibition, because federal alcohol taxes made legal spirits expensive compared to untaxed moonshine that mountain families had produced for generations. April 1934 meant spring planting season, when farmers prepared fields for crops that would supplement income from whiskey operations, generating more revenue than legitimate agriculture could provide. Temperatures warming into 60s during day, while nights remained cool enough that condensation coils on copper stills operated efficiently without requiring ice that would add expense-reducing profit margins. The county was notorious for moonshining, estimated that over 300 families operated stills, producing corn whiskey that supplied distributors throughout southeastern United States, generated economic activity sustaining mountain communities when legal employment barely existed during Depression years. John Wright was 42 years old in 1934, had operated moonshine business since 1920, when Prohibition had transformed previously marginal whiskey production into extraordinarily lucrative enterprise serving urban markets whose legal alcohol supplies had been eliminated by constitutional amendment. Wright had inherited small still from father, who'd produced modest quantities for local consumption, had recognized immediately that Prohibition created opportunity to expand operations dramatically by producing higher quality whiskey than competitors and by establishing reliable distribution networks connecting mountain producers with urban speakeasies willing to pay premium prices for superior product. By 1934, Wright controlled 11 stills throughout Cock County, producing approximately 8,000 gallons monthly, employed 43 workers including distillers, transporters, and enforcers, protecting operations from revenue agents and rival moonshiners, generated annual income exceeding $200,000 when average American family earned $1,500 yearly. Wright's success had been built on two foundations: product quality, that made his whiskey preferred brand among discerning drinkers who distinguished between harsh rot gut that many moonshiners produced and smooth corn liquor that Wright's careful distillation process created, and systematic violence that eliminated competitors threatening his market share or attempting to seize territory he'd claimed through 14 years of operations. Wright had killed his first rival in 1922, bootlegger named Carl Mitchell, who'd attempted to undercut Wright's prices by producing inferior whiskey and selling it to Wright's established customers at rates below what quality justified. Wright had warned Mitchell that price competition wouldn't be tolerated, that moonshine market required maintaining premium pricing that reflected product quality rather than racing toward bottom where profit margins would collapse. When Mitchell ignored warnings and continued undercutting, Wright shot him during delivery to Speakeasy in Knoxville. Systematic execution that sent message throughout regional moonshine community that Mountain Devil would eliminate anyone threatening his business model. Additional competitors had been killed between 1922 and 1934 as Wright expanded operations and defended territory from encroachment, bodies discovered in locations marking boundaries of empire that Wright had established through superior whiskey and willingness to use violence that other moonshiners couldn't match. By 1934, Wright's reputation as Mountain Devil, who'd killed multiple rivals, had become asset rather than liability. Potential competitors understood that challenging his market dominance carried risks that exceeded potential profits from entering territory he controlled. Distributors knew that purchasing Wright's whiskey meant dealing with supplier who'd protect their relationship through eliminating anyone attempting to disrupt established business arrangements. The violence had created stability that benefited everyone in Wright's network, reduced uncertainty and competition that might have undermined profits and created chaos, requiring constant vigilance against rivals. But Prohibition's repeal in December 1933 had disrupted equilibrium that Wright's violence had established, created situation where legal alcohol became available, competing with moonshine that had dominated market for 14 years. Legal distilleries could produce whiskey at industrial scale with quality control and branding that bootleggers couldn't match, could distribute through legitimate channels that didn't require bribing law enforcement or risking arrests that bootlegging operations faced constantly. Wright initially feared repeal would destroy his business, that customers would abandon illegal moonshine for legal spirits that carried no legal risks and that offered greater variety than mountain stills could produce. But Wright discovered that market remained for untaxed moonshine despite legal alternatives becoming available. Customers who preferred paying lower prices for whiskey that avoided federal excise taxes, adding substantial costs to legal alcohol. Traditionalists who valued locally produced corn liquor over corporate distillery products, regardless of quality differences, drinkers in dry counties, where local option laws prohibited legal alcohol sales, creating continued demand for bootlegged spirits. Wright adapted his business model to post-repeal environment by reducing prices slightly to compete with legal whiskey, while maintaining quality advantages that made his product preferred choice among customers who valued craft production over industrial manufacturing, by expanding into dry counties where legal alternatives weren't available, by cultivating relationships with distributors who'd remained in moonshine business despite repeal creating legal alternatives. The territorial conflict that would result in 15 deaths began in March 1934, when Harlan brothers, Thomas, William, and Robert, who'd operated moonshine business in neighboring Greene County, decided to expand into Wright's Cock County territory, believing that post-repeal market disruption had weakened Mountain Devil's control and created opportunity to seize customers and distribution routes that Wright had established over 14 years. Harlan brothers had heard stories about Wright's violence, but dismissed them as exaggerated legend, designed to intimidate competitors, believed that three brothers working together could defend operations against single individual, regardless of his reputation, calculated that Wright's business had been weakened by repeal, and that he wouldn't risk drawing law enforcement attention through violence that might give authorities excuse to shut down operations that were already operating on margins between legal and illegal status. Harlan brothers' first encroachment was establishing still in Cocker County Hollow that Wright had claimed since 1920. Location chosen specifically because it was known to be Wright's territory, and because operating there would demonstrate that Harlan operation wasn't intimidated by Mountain Devil's reputation. Thomas Harlan personally supervised still construction in late March, hired local men who'd previously worked for Wright, paid them premium wages to switch allegiance, and to provide intelligence about Wright's operations that would help Harlan brothers compete effectively. The still began production April 1st, producing whiskey that Thomas Harlan marketed aggressively to Wright's established customers at prices undercutting Wright by 20%, strategy designed to force Wright either to match lower prices and sacrifice profit margins, or to cede market share to Harlan operation that would grow by offering better value even if product quality didn't match Wright's superior distillation. Wright learned about Harlan encroachment on April 2nd from worker who'd been approached about switching to Harlan operation, but who'd remained loyal to employer who'd provided steady income for 8 years. Wright understood immediately that Harlan Brothers' challenge was existential threat. If he allowed them to operate in his territory without response, other competitors would recognize that Mountain Devil's enforcement had weakened and would attempt their own encroachments. Territorial boundaries that violence had established would collapse, creating chaotic competition that would undermine profits and stability that Wright's systematic elimination of rivals had created. Wright made decision that evening that Harlan operation needed to be eliminated completely and publicly, that every participant needed to die as demonstration that challenging his territory carried fatal consequences regardless of how many brothers worked together or how much they paid workers to betray established relationships. Wright's advantages were a combination of established intelligence network that informed him about competitors' activities and tactical experience from 12 years of defending territory through systematic violence. He knew locations of Harlan Brothers' still sites, understood their distribution routes and customer relationships, had identified vulnerabilities in their operations that inexperienced competitors hadn't recognized when planning expansion into territory defended by man whose willingness to kill had been proven repeatedly. Most significantly, Wright understood that territorial wars required decisive action. Gradual escalation would give Harlan Brothers time to fortify operations and recruit additional supporters, but systematic elimination executed quickly would destroy their operation before they could mount effective defense or retaliation. The systematic elimination began April 3rd, when worker who'd betrayed Wright by accepting Harlan employment was found dead near still site he'd helped construct, shot multiple times in execution, suggesting rage beyond simple business elimination, message that treachery against established employer carried consequences exceeding what betrayal of newer operation would generate. Death sent signal to other workers who'd been approached by Harlan Brothers, demonstrated that Wright's willingness to kill extended beyond competing owners to employees who violated loyalty by switching to rival operations. Several workers immediately quit Harlan employment after execution, understood that premium wages weren't worth risks of being killed by Mountain Devil, whose systematic violence had defined regional moonshine business for over a decade. Thomas Harlan was killed April 5th while transporting whiskey to Knoxville distributor who'd agreed to handle Harlan product despite long-standing relationship with Wright. Shot from ambush position overlooking road that Thomas traveled regularly without security precautions that Wright always maintained. Thomas's death was particularly significant because he'd been primary architect of Harlan expansion into Wright's territory, had personally recruited workers and customers, and had managed operations with confidence that 3 brothers working together could defend against single competitor. His elimination demonstrated that Wright would target leaders first. That assumption about safety in numbers was wrong when opponent possessed tactical sophistication and willingness to strike decisively rather than negotiating or gradual escalation. William and Robert Harlan fortified remaining operations after Thomas's death, hired guards to protect still sites and transportation routes, attempted to recruit additional allies who might help defend against Wright's systematic campaign, but fortifications proved inadequate when Wright struck April 8th with coordinated attacks on 2 Harlan still sites, burning both facilities and killing 4 guards who'd been hired to protect operations. Systematic destruction that demonstrated Wright could strike multiple locations simultaneously, and that defensive preparations couldn't protect against opponent who possessed superior resources and tactical planning capabilities. The attacks eliminated half of Harlan Brothers' production capacity, destroyed equipment representing significant capital investment, sent message that continued operations in Wright's territory would result in complete destruction of Harlan business through systematic violence they couldn't prevent. William Harlan attempted to negotiate peace with Wright on April 10th, proposed that Harlan operation would withdraw from Cock County in exchange for Wright, allowing them to maintain operations in Greene County without interference, suggested that territorial division would benefit both parties by eliminating destructive competition and creating stable boundaries that each could defend. But Wright refused negotiation, explained that Harlan Brothers' encroachment had violated territorial understanding that Wright's systematic violence had established, that allowing them to withdraw voluntarily rather than being eliminated completely would encourage future competitors to test boundaries, knowing they could retreat if resistance proved too costly. Wright's position was that territorial wars required total victory. Partial resolutions left enemies capable of future challenges, created uncertainty about whether boundaries would be enforced consistently. William Harlan was killed April 12th, leaving meeting where he'd attempted unsuccessfully to negotiate with Wright. Shot by sniper positioned on ridge overlooking route, he traveled returning to Greene County. His death left Robert as sole surviving Harlan brother, man who'd never wanted territorial expansion and who'd argued against challenging Wright's established operations, but who'd been overruled by Thomas and William, who'd believed opportunity existed to seize market share from competitor they'd underestimated catastrophically. Robert understood he faced choice between continuing operations and accepting death that Wright's systematic campaign would inevitably deliver, or withdrawing completely from Moonshine business and hoping Wright would accept his exit rather than pursuing elimination that pattern suggested was inevitable. Robert attempted to negotiate surrender April 14th, contacted Wright through intermediary offering to cease all Moonshine operations permanently in exchange for his life being spared, arguing that he'd opposed territorial expansion and that eliminating him would serve no purpose when Harlan operation had already been destroyed and when no threat remained to Wright's business. But Wright's response was that territorial wars couldn't be won through partial victories. Allowing Robert to survive would leave witness to Wright's systematic campaign, who might provide testimony to authorities if law enforcement ever attempted to prosecute Mountain Devil for multiple killings, would create precedent that challenging Wright's territory could be survived through negotiation rather than facing consequences that complete elimination represented. Robert Harlan was killed April 16th at his home in Greene County. Systematic execution that required Wright to leave his Cock County territory and strike in neighboring region, where he had fewer resources and less intelligence about law enforcement activities, demonstrated that Mountain Devil would pursue total elimination of threats, regardless of risks involved in operating beyond established boundaries. Robert's death completed destruction of Harlan operation, eliminated all three brothers who'd attempted to encroach on Wright's territory, sent message throughout regional Moonshine community that challenging Mountain Devil carried fatal consequences that couldn't be avoided through negotiation or withdrawal once conflict had begun. But Harlan brothers' deaths represented only a fraction of 15 eliminations that Wright conducted during April through June 1934. Remaining 12 deaths involved workers who'd betrayed Wright by accepting Harlan employment, distributors who'd agreed to handle Harlan product despite established relationships with Wright's operation, allies who'd provided support to Harlan brothers during territorial conflict. Wright's systematic campaign targeted everyone who'd participated in encroachment, demonstrated that territorial loyalty extended beyond ownership to include employees and business partners whose cooperation had enabled Harlan challenge to Wright's dominance. 3 distributors who'd handled Harlan whiskey were killed during late April. Executions that required Wright to strike in Knoxville, where his rural advantages disappeared and where urban law enforcement had greater capabilities than Mountain County sheriffs who'd been bribed or intimidated into ignoring Moonshine violence. The urban killings demonstrated Wright's confidence and capability, willingness to eliminate threats regardless of location or risks involved, sent message that business relationships with Wright carried obligations that couldn't be violated without fatal consequences. The distributors' deaths created terror throughout distribution network. Other middlemen who'd considered switching to competitors or handling multiple suppliers understood that exclusive loyalty to Wright was life or death requirement rather than merely preferred business arrangement. Additional workers and associates connected to Harlan operation were killed during May and early June. Systematic elimination that continued weeks after Harlan brothers' deaths and after their operation had been completely destroyed demonstrated that Wright's campaign was about establishing precedent rather than simply defending against immediate threat. By mid-June, 15 people had died in territorial war that Harlan brothers had initiated through underestimating Mountain Devil's willingness to use systematic violence defending empire he'd built over 14 years. The deaths had re-established Wright's absolute control over Cocker County Moonshine operations, created atmosphere where potential competitors understood that challenging his dominance would result in complete destruction regardless of how well-planned encroachment appeared or how many allies supported challenge. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation deployed agents to Cock County in June 1934, attempted to investigate 15 deaths that everyone understood were connected to Moonshine territorial war. But that couldn't be prosecuted without witnesses willing to testify against Wright or physical evidence connecting him to systematic killings. Agents interviewed hundreds of residents, examined murder scenes, attempted to develop case that would support prosecution, despite knowing that mountain communities protected moonshiners who provided economic activity, sustaining regions where legal employment barely existed. Investigation collapsed by August, when prosecutors acknowledged they couldn't develop evidence meeting standards for conviction, that circumstantial connections between Wright and murders weren't sufficient, when witnesses refused cooperation, and when physical evidence had been destroyed or concealed by associates protecting employer, whose systematic violence had created prosperity and stability throughout his organization. Wright's territorial war succeeded completely. No competitor attempted to enter his Cockey County operations. For remaining 2 decades, he operated moonshine business. Distributors maintained exclusive relationships, understanding that violations would carry fatal consequences. Workers remained loyal, knowing that betrayal meant death rather than merely unemployment. The violence had created monopoly that benefited Wright economically, while establishing reputation as Mountain Devil, whose willingness to kill exceeded anything competitors could match, made him legendary figure throughout southeastern moonshine community. As businessman who defended empire through systematic elimination, proving that illegal markets rewarded violence when legal remedies weren't available to resolve territorial disputes. John Wright continued operating moonshine business through 1950s, despite legal alcohol's increasing availability, and despite federal law enforcement's occasional attempts to shut down operations that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. He died in 1962 at age 70, heart attack taking him while inspecting still site he'd operated for over 40 years, buried in family cemetery, on property where he'd built whiskey empire that systematic violence had defended. His obituary mentioned he'd been businessman and community leader, without reference to moonshine operations or 15 deaths in 1934 territorial war. Euphemistic language that allowed legitimate society to honor man whose criminal enterprise had sustained mountain economy while avoiding explicit acknowledgement of violence that had made his success possible. The legacy persists in debates about economic violence and illegal market regulation, about whether killing 15 people could be justified when defending business territory, built through superior product and established relationships, about what entrepreneurs in illegal industries will do when legal systems can't resolve territorial disputes that legitimate businesses address through litigation or regulatory intervention. The Mountain Devil case demonstrated that prohibition of products consumers demand creates markets where violence substitutes for legal conflict resolution. That businessman defending empire through systematic elimination differs from criminal psychopath primarily through economic rationality, motivating violence rather than sadistic pleasure in killing. The immediate aftermath of John Wright's systematic elimination of 15 rivals in 1934 territorial war created unprecedented consolidation throughout Eastern Tennessee moonshine industry, demonstrated to potential competitors that Mountain Devil's willingness to use violence exceeded anything they could match, and that challenging his territorial dominance would result in complete destruction regardless of resources, challenges possessed, or alliances they'd formed. The 15 deaths had re-established absolute control that Wright had built since 1920, eliminated uncertainty about territorial boundaries that competitors might have exploited if Harlan Brothers had succeeded in establishing operations within Wright's domain, created stability that benefited entire distribution network by reducing risks that chaotic competition would have generated for everyone dependent on moonshine trade. Wright's business expanded significantly during late 1934 and 1935, following territorial war's conclusion, absorbed Harlan Brothers' former customers and distribution routes in Greene County that had been left without supplier after systematic elimination campaign had destroyed competing operation. Wright established 3 additional stills in Greene County by early 1935, hired workers who'd previously been employed by Harlan operation, and who understood that loyalty to new employer was life or death requirement rather than merely preferred business arrangement. Increased total production to 12,000 gallons monthly serving markets throughout southeastern Tennessee and northern Georgia, where distributors appreciated dealing with supplier whose monopoly position meant consistent pricing and availability without competitive disruptions. The expansion generated additional revenue exceeding $300,000 annually by 1936, made Wright among wealthiest individuals in Cock County, despite his income being entirely from illegal enterprise that couldn't be reported to tax authorities or invested through legitimate financial institutions. Wright accumulated cash reserves hidden throughout properties he controlled, purchased additional land under family members' names to avoid drawing attention to accumulation that legitimate employment couldn't have generated, established sophisticated money laundering operations through businesses that appeared legitimate, but that existed primarily to convert moonshine proceeds into assets that could be held openly without triggering investigations into income sources. But expansion also increased Wright's exposure to federal law enforcement that had become more aggressive about targeting large-scale moonshine operations following Prohibition's repeal, Treasury Department's alcohol tax unit viewing illegal whiskey production as tax evasion rather than violation of constitutional prohibition that had been eliminated by 21st Amendment. Federal agents raided 2 of Wright's stills in November 1936, seized equipment worth thousands of dollars, arrested 6 workers who were subsequently convicted of operating illegal distillery and sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 1 to 3 years. The raids represented escalation beyond local law enforcement that Wright had managed through bribes and intimidation, federal government possessing resources and determination that county sheriffs lacked or were unwilling to deploy against moonshiner who generated economic activity sustaining mountain communities. Wright responded to federal pressure through combination of improved operational security and strategic violence against informants who provided intelligence to Treasury agents. 3 suspected informants were killed between December 1936 and March 1937, executions that sent message that cooperating with federal enforcement carried fatal consequences, that workers needed to accept prison sentences if arrested rather than providing testimony that might reduce individual punishment, but that would expose broader operations to prosecution. The killings were effective deterrent. Subsequent federal raids yielded minimal intelligence beyond what agents could observe directly at specific still sites. Workers refused to cooperate even when facing significant prison terms, maintained code of silence protecting employer, whose systematic violence had proven more immediate threat than abstract possibility of federal prosecution. Wright's operational adaptations included decentralizing production across more numerous smaller stills rather than operating fewer large-scale facilities that represented attractive targets for federal raids, establishing cell structure where workers at individual sites had minimal knowledge about broader organization that might be revealed if they were arrested and interrogated, rotating still locations every few months to prevent informants from providing current intelligence about operations that moved too frequently for federal agents to track effectively. The organizational changes reduced efficiency somewhat, but dramatically improved security, made systematic federal prosecution of entire operation nearly impossible, when each successful raid eliminated only small fraction of total production capacity that could be quickly replaced. Family succession became significant consideration for Wright during late 1930s, as he approached 50 years old, and as health problems from decades of heavy drinking began affecting his physical capabilities. Understood that maintaining empire through combination of business acumen and systematic violence would become increasingly difficult as age reduced stamina and reflexes that tactical operations required. Wright's three sons, John Jr., age 24, Thomas, age 22, and William, age 19 in 1940, had grown up in moonshine business, had learned distillation techniques and distribution logistics and enforcement tactics through working in father's operations since adolescence, represented potential successors who could maintain family control over enterprise that systematic violence had built and defended. But succession created complications that legitimate businesses didn't face. Transferring control of criminal enterprise required sons to demonstrate willingness to use violence that had been essential to father's success, needed to prove to workers and competitors that new generation possessed same ruthlessness that Mountain Devil's reputation had been built upon, couldn't simply inherit authority through family relationship, without establishing personal credibility through actions demonstrating they'd kill to defend operations just as father had done repeatedly. Wright understood that smooth succession required his sons to participate in enforcement operations while he remained active, that transitioning authority gradually would be more successful than sudden handoff, that might create perception that new leadership was unproven or that empire's violent foundations had been abandoned. John Jr. killed his first rival in 1941, bootlegger, who'd attempted to establish operation in territory that Wright controlled. Systematic execution conducted under father's supervision that demonstrated eldest son possessed tactical capability and psychological willingness to murder that business succession required. The killing established John Jr. His credibility within organization, proved to workers and competitors that next generation would maintain violent enforcement that father had practiced for 20 years, created foundation for gradual transition where John Jr. assumed increasing operational responsibilities, while Wright Sr. focused on strategic planning and relationship management with distributors and corrupt officials who facilitated illegal operations. World War II created both challenges and opportunities for Wright's moonshine empire between 1942 and 1945, federal government's mobilization of resources for war effort, reducing Treasury Department's capacity to pursue illegal alcohol operations, while rationing of legitimate whiskey created increased demand for moonshine that could be produced without restrictions on grain supplies that limited legal distilleries' output. Wright expanded production to 15,000 gallons monthly by 1944, hired workers who'd been rejected for military service or who'd received agricultural deferments, allowing them to remain in essential civilian employment that moonshine production was classified under through bribes to local draft boards, sold whiskey to military bases where soldiers paid premium prices for alcohol, supplementing inadequate supplies that official channels provided. The wartime expansion generated extraordinary profits, exceeding $500,000 annually by 1945, revenues that Wright invested in purchasing additional properties and legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for money laundering operations, converting illegal proceeds into assets that appeared to be generated through legal commerce. Wright acquired stake in timber company, purchased share of coal mine, invested in retail businesses throughout eastern Tennessee, created portfolio that would provide legitimate income sources for family after moonshine operations eventually became untenable through federal enforcement pressure or market changes eliminating demand for illegal alcohol. Post-war period brought renewed federal enforcement pressure as Treasury Department redirected resources from war effort toward domestic law enforcement, including aggressive pursuit of large-scale moonshine operations that had expanded during wartime reduction in regulatory oversight. Multiple raids during 1946 and 1947 targeted Wright's operations, destroyed several stills, and resulted in arrests of dozen workers who received federal prison sentences, created sustained pressure that reduced production and profitability while forcing operational changes that increased costs and complicated logistics. Wright understood that long-term viability of moonshine business was questionable. That federal government possessed resources to prosecute illegal alcohol production persistently. Even if individual raids didn't eliminate operations completely, that eventual succession to sons needed to include transition toward legitimate businesses that could sustain family wealth without depending on criminal enterprise. Wright began systematic transition during late 1940s, reduced moonshine production gradually while expanding legitimate business interests, positioned sons to manage legal operations that could become primary income sources as illegal whiskey became less profitable and more risky. John Jr. assumed management of timber company in 1948. Thomas took control of retail businesses in 1949. William maintained oversight of remaining moonshine operations that continued generating significant revenue, but that represented declining share of families' total income as legitimate enterprises grew. The transition was a calculated business decision reflecting Wright's understanding that Prohibition-era opportunities were ending, that illegal markets eventually faced either elimination through enforcement or legitimization through regulatory changes, that families building wealth through criminal enterprises needed exit strategies before government pressure or market evolution destroyed operations completely. Wright suffered first heart attack in 1952 at age 60, survived, but recognized that health problems would prevent him from maintaining active role in family businesses, regardless of whether they were legitimate or illegal. Accelerated transition towards sons' complete control, while he remained available for strategic advice, but no longer managed daily operations. The retirement represented remarkable achievement for a man whose wealth had been built through systematic violence. Unlike many criminals whose careers ended through imprisonment or death from rivals' violence, Wright successfully transitioned from active criminal to retired businessman, whose illegal origins were known, but whose current income appeared to come from legitimate sources that authorities couldn't easily challenge. The remaining moonshine operations were eliminated in 1956, after a series of federal raids that convinced family the risks exceeded profits. Final stills were destroyed rather than seized to prevent evidence from being used in prosecutions. Workers were paid severance and assisted in finding legitimate employment. Systematic shutdown that reflected business calculation rather than enforcement victory. Wright family chose to exit illegal alcohol production when risk-reward analysis indicated that continuing operations was economically irrational given federal pressure and declining profit margins as legal whiskey became increasingly competitive. John Wright died February 8, 1962, at age 70, massive heart attack, taking him while visiting timber company office, surrounded by sons who'd successfully transitioned family wealth from criminal origins to legitimate businesses, generating millions of dollars annually. His funeral drew over 1,200 mourners from throughout eastern Tennessee, testament to legendary status he'd achieved as Mountain Devil, who'd built moonshine empire through superior product and systematic violence, businessman who'd defended territory through eliminating 15 rivals in 1934, war that had re-established his absolute dominance. Multiple speakers delivered eulogies celebrating Wright as entrepreneur and community benefactor, whose businesses provided employment and economic activity sustaining mountain regions. Carefully worded tributes that avoided explicit reference to moonshine operations or violence that had enabled his success while allowing everyone present to understand that his wealth had been built through illegal enterprise defended by murder. Wright was buried in family cemetery on property he'd purchased in 1925, simple gravestone listing name and dates, without mentioning Mountain Devil nickname or 15 deaths in 1934, territorial war, or subsequent killings that had maintained empire through systematic elimination of threats. But visitors to cemetery would gather at gravesite, tell stories about moonshiner who'd killed anyone challenging his territory, transform Wright into folk hero whose business acumen and violent enforcement had succeeded where legal entrepreneurs couldn't have operated, created legacy that family would struggle to honor while distancing themselves from criminal origins that had generated their inherited wealth. John Jr. continued managing legitimate businesses through 1970s and 1980s, expanded timber operations, and diversified into real estate development and banking. Built fortune exceeding $10 million by 1980 through investments that appeared to have no connection to Moonshine origins, though everyone in Eastern Tennessee understood that Wright family wealth traced directly to father's illegal operations. John Jr. died in 1990 at age 74, having successfully completed transition from criminal enterprise to legitimate business that father had begun in late 1940s, leaving estate to children who'd grown up knowing about grandfather's Mountain Devil legacy, but who'd never participated in illegal operations themselves. The 21st century brought final chapters in Wright family story when craft distillery movement created ironic situation where illegal moonshine production that grandfather had practiced became romanticized heritage that legitimate businesses marketed to consumers seeking authentic Appalachian whiskey experiences. Multiple craft distilleries throughout Eastern Tennessee adopted branding referencing moonshine traditions, told stories about mountain bootleggers who'd produced superior whiskey despite Prohibition's legal restrictions, sold premium-priced spirits to urban consumers whose fascination with outlaw culture made them willing to pay $50 per bottle for products marketed as being connected to authentic criminal heritage. Wright family's response to craft distillery movement was complicated by tension between capitalizing on grandfather's legendary status and distancing themselves from violence that had enabled his business success. Thomas Wright III, John Jr. is son and John Sr. is grandson, age 52 in 2012, proposed establishing craft distillery that would openly acknowledge family's moonshine heritage, would market whiskey as being produced using traditional Wright family recipes and techniques, would transform Mountain Devil from criminal into brand identity representing authentic Appalachian craft production. The proposal generated intense family debate. Some members argued that commercializing grandfather's violence was inappropriate regardless of profit potential. Others maintained that craft distillery would allow family to honor heritage while operating legally, that consumers already romanticized moonshine culture, and that Wright family had greater claim to authenticity than corporate distilleries appropriating mountain traditions without historical connections. The debate intensified in 2013 when documentary filmmaker Patricia Morrison produced comprehensive examination of 1934 territorial war, film titled Mountain Devil, Business and Violence in Prohibition-Era Tennessee, that featured interviews with historians, with Wright family members describing how grandfather had built empire through systematic elimination, with descendants of 15 victims expressing continuing anger that their great-grandfather's killer had died wealthy and respected, while families of murdered men had received no justice or compensation. The documentary presented most balanced account possible, given competing narratives, acknowledged both Wright's business acumen and his systematic violence as components of success story, where superior product and ruthless enforcement had combined to create monopoly that authorities couldn't dismantle and that competitors couldn't challenge. Most powerful segment featured joint interview with Thomas Wright III, grandson of Mountain Devil, and Rebecca Harlan, great-granddaughter of Thomas Harlan, who'd been killed by Wright in 1934 territorial war. Thomas defended grandfather's violence as necessary business practice in illegal markets where legal dispute resolution wasn't available, argued that Harlan brothers' encroachment had violated territorial understanding that Wright's systematic violence had established, maintained that eliminating 15 people had been proportional response to existential threat against empire built through 14 years of superior product and reliable service. Rebecca described how great-grandfather's death had destroyed family economically, how Harlan operations elimination had left widow and children impoverished, while Wright prospered from monopoly that violence had defended, argued that celebrating Mountain Devil as successful businessmen required ignoring suffering inflicted on families whose breadwinners had been murdered for attempting to compete in market, that Wright controlled through terror. The exchange revealed unbridgeable gap between competing perspectives. Thomas unable to acknowledge that grandfather's systematic violence had destroyed innocent families whose members had simply attempted to earn livings through moonshine production. Rebecca unable to accept that great-grandfather's encroachment had violated business norms in illegal markets where territorial respect was enforced through elimination rather than litigation. Documentary director Morrison explained in commentary that she'd hoped interview would demonstrate possibility of reconciliation between families affected by 1934 war, but instead it revealed that 80 years wasn't sufficient time for healing wounds created when business competition in illegal markets had been resolved through systematic murder. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered business records showing that Wright had maintained detailed accounting of territorial war expenses, had calculated costs of eliminating 15 rivals including ammunition, travel expenses, and payments to associates who'd assisted in murders, had determined that systematic elimination had been cost-effective business decision generating return on investment through monopoly profits that violence had secured. Records demonstrated Wright's purely economic approach to violence. Killings hadn't been motivated by personal animosity or sadistic pleasure, but by calculated judgment that eliminating competitors cost less than tolerating competition that would have reduced profit margins and market share. The revelation sparked intense debate about whether economic rationality made Wright's violence more or less morally culpable than murders motivated by rage or revenge, whether viewing systematic elimination as business expense rather than personal vendetta made him calculating psychopath or simply rational entrepreneur, operating in market where violence was standard business practice. Thomas Wright III argued that grandfather's economic rationality demonstrated he'd been businessman rather than criminal, that systematic violence had been defensive response to competitive threat rather than aggressive empire building, that applying moral standards from legitimate markets to illegal enterprises was inappropriate when legal systems didn't provide conflict resolution mechanisms. Critics countered that economic rationality made violence more rather than less reprehensible, that calculating costs of murder demonstrated sociopathic detachment from human suffering, that treating systematic elimination as business expense revealed moral bankruptcy that wealth and commercial success couldn't excuse. Wright family's debate about craft distillery proposal reached crisis in 2014, when Thomas III announced plans to proceed despite objections from family members who opposed commercializing grandfather's violence, filed applications with Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission for licenses to operate distillery and retail sales room, designed branding that would reference Mountain Devil nickname and would market whiskey as being produced using authentic recipes from Prohibition-era operations. Opposition within family intensified when Thomas's cousin Jennifer Wright, granddaughter of William Wright who'd managed final moonshine operations in 1950s, published essay titled "We Must Not Profit from Violence," a Wright family member's opposition to Mountain Devil Distillery. Jennifer's essay argued that establishing craft distillery, celebrating grandfather's moonshine operations, required ignoring systematic violence that had enabled his business success, that marketing whiskey using Mountain Devil branding would commercialize murders of 15 people whose families still lived in eastern Tennessee and who deserved not to see killer's nickname transformed into profitable brand identity. She acknowledged that grandfather had been skilled businessman whose product quality had earned legitimate reputation, but maintained that his systematic elimination of competitors couldn't be separated from commercial success when violence had been an essential component of monopoly that had generated family wealth. Jennifer proposed alternative that would acknowledge moonshine heritage without celebrating violence, establishing distillery under different branding that would reference Wright family's distillation expertise without invoking Mountain Devil nickname or explicitly connecting legal operations to grandfather's criminal enterprise. Thomas responded that sanitizing family history meant denying grandfather the recognition he deserved for building business empire in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, that consumers already romanticized moonshine culture, and that Wright family had more authentic claim to heritage than corporate distilleries, whose branding appropriated traditions without historical connections. He argued that craft distillery would honor grandfather's entrepreneurial achievement while operating legally, that transforming illegal operations into legitimate business represented exactly the transition that grandfather had begun in late 1940s and that sons had completed by 1956. That commercialization was natural evolution rather than inappropriate exploitation of violence. The Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission approved Thomas's applications in 2015, granted licenses for Mountain Devil Craft Distillery and retail sales room located in Cock County near property where grandfather had operated stills during Prohibition era. The approvals generated protests from descendants of 15 victims and from advocacy groups opposing glorification of criminal violence. Petition with over 3,000 signatures demanded that Commission revoke licenses on grounds that celebrating systematic murderer through commercial branding was inappropriate, regardless of how much time had passed since crimes occurred. Commission defended approval, arguing that distillery met all legal requirements for licensing. That grandfather's criminal history wasn't relevant to whether family members could operate legitimate business, decades after illegal operations had ended, that denying licenses based on ancestors' crimes would establish precedent, preventing many Appalachian families from participating in craft distillery movement, given region's extensive moonshine heritage. Mountain Devil Craft Distillery opened in May 2016, controversy generating publicity that attracted thousands of visitors during first month of operations, tourists purchasing whiskey marketed as being produced using recipes and techniques from family's Prohibition-era moonshine business, taking photographs beside displays, documenting grandfather's operations and reputation as feared enforcer who'd eliminated competitors threatening territorial dominance. Sales exceeded projections dramatically. Distillery grossed over $2 million in first year, through combination of retail sales and distribution to bars and restaurants throughout Tennessee, marketing authentically produced Appalachian craft whiskey. But commercial success intensified opposition from victims' families and from Wright family members, including Jennifer, who'd publicly opposed distillery. Protests outside retail sales room disrupted business regularly during 2016 and 2017. Confrontations between protesters and customers occasionally became heated when visitors defended their right to purchase whiskey, regardless of whether branding referenced murderer. Most dramatic protest occurred in September 2017, when Rebecca Harlan led group of descendants placing photographs of 15 victims at distillery entrance, images showing men who'd been killed in 1934 territorial war, alongside captions describing how they died and how their families had suffered, while Wright had prospered from monopoly that violence had defended. Thomas Wright III responded by installing permanent memorial acknowledging 15 victims at distillery entrance, plaque listing names and death dates of everyone killed during 1934 territorial war, statement explaining that Mountain Devil Distillery recognized that grandfather's business success had been built partly through violence that had destroyed families, and that distillery's commercial operations didn't represent endorsement of systematic elimination, but rather acknowledgement of complete history, including both entrepreneurial achievement and moral costs. The memorial was controversial compromise. Victims' families appreciated acknowledgement, but argued that profiting from Mountain Devil brand while displaying token memorial was inadequate response to commercializing violence. Supporters maintained that honest recognition of history's complexity was appropriate, and that distillery shouldn't be expected to abandon successful business model because some found marketing offensive. By 2024, Mountain Devil Craft Distillery had become major tourist attraction, generating over $5 million annually, employed 43 workers in production and retail operations, distributed products throughout southeastern United States, where consumers paid premium prices for whiskey, marketed as authentic Appalachian craft, produced using traditional methods from family with genuine moonshine heritage. Thomas Wright III had expanded operations to include tours of historical still sites on family property, museum documenting Prohibition-era operations, with exhibits about grandfather's business practices and territorial enforcement, educational programs about moonshine history that attempted to balance romanticization with acknowledgement of violence that had been integral to illegal alcohol industry. The distillery's success generated ongoing debate about whether commercializing criminal heritage was appropriate capitalism or exploitation of violence, whether descendants bore responsibility for sanitizing ancestors' crimes, or whether honest acknowledgement of complexity was sufficient. Jennifer Wright maintained her opposition through 2024, continued publishing essays arguing that profiting from Mountain Devil brand was morally indefensible, regardless of how successful business became, that family had obligation to refuse wealth generated through celebrating systematic murderer, even if consumers wanted to purchase products marketed using grandfather's violence. Thomas countered that distillery represented completion of grandfather's vision for transitioning family wealth from illegal to legitimate operations, that legal whiskey production using traditional techniques honored entrepreneurial achievement while operating within regulatory frameworks that hadn't existed during Prohibition era. The Wright family cemetery became pilgrimage site for whiskey enthusiasts and crime history buffs, visitors gathering at grandfather's grave to photograph simple gravestone marking man whose systematic violence had built fortune that descendants had transformed into legal enterprise, whose Mountain Devil nickname had evolved from feared enforcer into commercial brand generating millions of dollars annually. Tours at distillery always concluded at cemetery, where guides presented complicated narrative about businessmen whose success had required systematic elimination of 15 competitors, but whose eventual transition toward legitimacy had enabled descendants to build legal operations that provided employment and economic activity while marketing heritage that romanticized criminal origins. Historical marker at graveside captured irreducible complexity. John Wright built Moonshine empire through combination of superior product quality and systematic violence, eliminating competitors who threatened territorial dominance. In 1934, Wright killed 15 rivals who'd attempted to establish operations in territory he'd controlled since 1920, including 3 Harlan brothers, whose encroachment violated business norms in illegal markets, where disputes were resolved through elimination rather than litigation. Wright's economic rationality in calculating costs of systematic murder demonstrated purely business approach to violence that differed from revenge or psychopathic killing through instrumental purpose rather than sadistic pleasure. His descendants transformed illegal operations into legitimate craft distillery marketing Mountain Devil brand that commercializes violence while acknowledging victims through memorial. This grave reminds us that prohibition creates illegal markets where violence substitutes for legal dispute resolution, that entrepreneurial success in criminal enterprises requires capabilities including systematic murder, and that descendants inherit both wealth and moral complexity when ancestors' achievements were built through violence that destroyed innocent families. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of economic violence across 90 years, the territorial war that killed 15 people defending business empire built through superior product and systematic enforcement, the successful transition from illegal moonshine to legitimate business that grandfather planned and descendants completed, the craft distillery movement's commercialization of criminal heritage, transforming Mountain Devil from feared murderer into profitable brand identity, the impossible questions about whether economic rationality makes violence more or less morally culpable than emotional killing, whether descendants should refuse wealth generated through celebrating systematic murderer, or whether honest acknowledgement of complexity is sufficient, leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories that force examination of how illegal markets create violence as business practice, that acknowledge both entrepreneurial achievement and systematic murder as components of success, requiring capabilities beyond what legitimate businesses demand, that demonstrate how Prohibition's legacy persists through craft distillery movement, romanticizing criminal heritage while sanitizing violence that was integral to moonshine industry. Comment about whether Thomas Wright III should operate Mountain Devil Distillery, or whether Jennifer Wright is correct that profiting from grandfather's violence is morally indefensible, whether economic rationality demonstrated by cost accounting for systematic elimination makes Wright businessman or sociopath, whether memorial acknowledging 15 victims while profiting from Mountain Devil brand represents appropriate compromise or inadequate response to commercializing violence. Because these questions persist wherever criminal enterprises transition to legitimacy, wherever descendants inherit wealth built through violence, wherever craft industries market authenticity by romanticizing illegal heritage, wherever economic success requires acknowledging that entrepreneurial achievement in prohibited markets demands capabilities, including systematic murder, that legal businesses never face. Until next time, remember that John Wright killed 15 rivals defending whiskey empire, built through 14 years of superior product and systematic enforcement, that his violence was motivated by economic calculation rather than rage or revenge, that descendants successfully transitioned illegal operations to legitimate business generating millions annually. That Mountain Devil nickname evolved from feared enforcer to commercial brand marketed, to consumers romanticizing Appalachian moonshine heritage, and that ultimately entrepreneurial success in illegal markets creates moral complexity that persists across generations when descendants must decide whether to refuse wealth built through violence or to acknowledge complete history while profiting from achievements that required systematic murder.